This news segment is brought to you by the Herald Ledger, the voice of Lyon County since 1901. Pick up a copy today, join us online for our e-edition, or catch us on Facebook.
Well, hello again. I'm Jim Atchison with LakeLand TV, and I'm happy to announce today that we're introducing a new feature that will be playing from time to time this year, and we're calling it LakeLand Legends. And in this feature, we'll be meeting and talking with people who have had an influence on the Lakeland region here in Western Kentucky. What better way could we start than to introduce to you a person who's been coming into your living room and reporting the news for over 40 years, and that's Bobbie Foust, who currently works and reports for the Herald Ledger. Good morning, Bobbie.
Good morning, Jim.
Bobbie, let's go back to the beginning. I mentioned the 40 years, but it's my understanding that you started as a $1 an hour office clerk in a Western Kentucky newspaper. Is that true?
That is true, Jim. I had been a stay-at-home mom for about 13 years, and my children were all in school. My oldest daughter, Donna, was 13. My twin daughters were 11, Jackie and Terry, and my son, Dennis, was 9. And the owners of the Benton Tribune Democrat, Mamie and Bill Nelson, had started a newspaper in Calvert City, a weekly newspaper they call the Calvert News. And I noticed that the Calvert News office wasn't open all the time, and I was looking for something interesting to do, and I thought, well, I'll give Mamie a call, which I did, and ask her if she needed any help in the office. She said she did, and she would pay me $1 an hour, and I could take off in time to pick my children up from school.
Well, that seems to indicate that you really weren't planning a career on journalism. Did you have any formal journalism training? Or to me, it's like a lot of the older reporters that I'm familiar with that were very good at what they did, but really didn't prepare for a career in journalism.
I really didn't. I had a few college hours, most of which were in journalism or writing. I had an uncle who was a journalist, a career journalist, and he had said when I was growing up that I was going to the University of Missouri, which was and still is one of the best journalism schools in the nation, and I was going to be a journalist. Well, I didn't do that. I got married and I began raising a family. But I thought that working for that little weekly newspaper would be something that would be fun to do and take up my extra time.
You've spent most of your career basically reporting in rural settings. Does that affect your style? I guess what I'm asking here is there a difference between what you do and what is done in the, one of the better words, big city type newspapers?
There is, of course. There has to be. A reporter knows the people he or she goes out and interviews, knows them personally most of the time, many of them. In the big cities, it's more impersonal, I think, but the facts are the same. Whether you're in Eddyville, Kentucky, or New York City, the facts of any story, especially a hard news story, are the same. You report the facts, you report them straight down the middle, and just let it fall where it may. And yes, in a small town, you will likely have some folks that become upset with you on certain occasions. But if you continue in your work to be fair, then usually any momentary anger or people who become upset, usually that will fade, and with just a little bit of time. But you do have to consider the feelings of people you're dealing with, and oftentimes you have to use a little bit of diplomacy.
You know, that leads me into my next question, because even from my own experience, I know that you're somebody who says, you know, you want to report both sides of a controversial issue. And there are always, in rural areas, there are always controversial issues. How difficult it is, because I know that sometimes you have personal feelings on one side or the other of the issue. How difficult is it to keep that out of the story?
Well, it is difficult, of course. the idea that a reporter is objective is a fallacy. Reporters have and form opinions, but my idea is that you may read my opinion on the editorial page if I write a column of the newspaper, but you will not detect it. My goal is that you will not detect it in my news story. I have always worked to write my stories, as I said, straight down the middle, and I attempt to tell both sides. I attempt to interview someone or different people on both sides or multiple sides of any issue that is of interest to the public that I am covering.
Well, I know that that's obvious in your work because I've been reading for not quite 40 years, but for a number of years of some of the things you've done. I want to turn a minute to the lighter side because I know that you have interviewed several luminaries. I know that you've talked to Bill Clinton on a couple of occasions.
I did, yes.
Adolph Rupp, who's one of my favorites, Jesse Jackson, Billy Graham, to name a few. Have you ever felt intimidated by the person you're interviewing? And maybe more importantly, on the way to that interview, how do you prepare mentally for it?
Well, no, I've never felt intimidated. I just simply prepare by learning all I can about the person's philosophy, what the person's goals are, and just go from there. And yes, I will have in my mind, I don't have a written set of questions, but I will have in my mind some things that I would like the person to comment upon. And then as we get into the interview, one question will probably lead to at least one more and possibly many others.
Well, now, Bobbie, the late Adolph Rupp was known as an intimidator, and I find that hard to believe that sitting in his presence and interviewing him wasn't just a little bit intimidating. Tell me about that interview.
That was an interesting interview. Mr. Rupp was abrupt. There's no question that he was, but he was very nice to me. He had come to Western Kentucky for an appearance, and I had the opportunity. I was among some reporters who had an opportunity to talk with him, and he was very nice. Now he was abrupt and to the point, and he did not suffer foolish questions, but I knew that in advance. My husband and I had been to Lexington many times on press day, and had not necessarily interviewed him, but had interviewed perhaps some of his players, but had taken photos of the players, and I knew Mr. Rupp's mannerism, and so I attempted not to ask foolish questions.
Well, that's interesting. You mentioned your late husband, Ray.
Yes.
Who was a excellent photographer.
He was.
I don't believe he did it really professionally.
We had a business, Jim, but it was a small, very small business, and it was more a hobby than a business. I doubt that he made very much money. I think maybe he paid for our equipment and for perhaps the expense of taking pictures, but he dearly loved taking sports pictures. He dearly loved going to ball games, taking action pictures. That was his love of life, and he loved taking group shots. I walked into Anchorage's when I came to work here, and I looked up on the wall over the front area and noticed a large groups of Lyon County baseball teams. And I said to Paul, well, those look like pictures my late husband may have taken. And he said, they are.
And of course, several of his pictures appeared many times side by side with one of your stories.
Yes, yes.
Well, that's interesting. Bobbie, just for fun, what person, living or dead, would you most like to interview, and why?
I would love to interview President James Madison, and the reason for that is that he was of course, the principal writer of the Constitution of the United States. He was the writer of the Bill of Rights, which were passed later on. He did not believe that the Bill of Rights were necessary, and I'd like to ask him why he didn't believe they were necessary. he didn't believe that the Constitution would last. And I'd like to ask him why he didn't believe it would last. It is such a perfect and a living document. And perhaps that's the reason, but from what I have read, there are no specific reasons given for his belief, just his belief that he did not think that it would endure.
And of course, one of the reasons it's a living document is there was a provision in the original Constitution for amendments.
Indeed.
A lot of people don't realize that the Bill of Rights came some 20 years after the adoption of the Constitution, and there was a debate as to whether or not it gave the state, the government, too many rights, and people like James Madison. And I think Monroe was involved to a certain extent, but I'm not exactly sure how. And that's how we came about getting the Bill of Rights, primarily because of Madison's feelings.
Right. I'd also like to interview my great-great-grandfather on my father's side. He believed, and this is in family history, probably can't be documented, but he believed that he was descended from William the Conqueror. It can be documented back to the 15th century. Beyond that, it gets a little fuzzy, but he gives his reasons for it in the family history. His name was Martin Birdwood Carter, and he is an ancestor of the famous Carter family of music fame. I'd also like to interview President Barack Obama.
That's interesting.
I think President Obama is an extremely intelligent man, and I think he has the high, lofty goals for this country. I think he is serving because he feels that he can better this nation, and I believe that perhaps he will, in years to come, be looked upon as a great president.
Bobbie, I know that over a 40-year career, there are bound to be some people that have had an influence on you and your style and your philosophy. And one of them would be probably the late C.L. Backus and his wife, Frances, who you may have considered a mentor. How much influence do people like that have on your career?
Oh, great influence. C.L. Backus was a journalist. He worked in a small town, Eddyville, Kentucky. He started a newspaper here, and he bought another newspaper, this newspaper. And he was an old-time journalist in the fashion of a journalist, and I greatly admired him. He was a mentor, and his wife Frances, my dear friend Frances, was by his side the whole way, and they produced a great newspaper for the time and for the people of Eddyville, Kentucky. C.L. felt that there were certain things people wanted to know, there were certain things they might not want to know, but there were things they might not want to know that they needed to know, and he informed the public as to what they needed to know.
So C.L. then would be somebody that we would be considering for Lakeland legends today.
He would indeed.
Bobbie, were there any other people that you would consider mentors in your career? I'm sure there were.
There were, of course. My uncle was a mentor. I mentioned him earlier. My uncle's name was Ed Freeman. He was 36-year journalist with the Nashville Tennessean. He went to work for the Tennessean as a very young man after he was discharged from the U.S. Navy. He was an officer in the U.S. Navy, and he worked a few years as a reporter, then became the city editor, and the last 12 years of his life he was the managing editor of the Nashville Tennessean. And he had a great influence on my life. He often talked to me about writing. He felt I had a talent for writing, and I did win some writing competition when I was in high school and grade school. And yes, my uncle Ed Freeman was a mentor. One thing about him, he was an officer, as I said, in the U.S. Navy, and he served aboard an evacuation ship evacuating lepers from Indochina. And when he came back, he said to the family, I don't know if he told anyone else, but he said to the family, the United States should never become involved in a war in Indochina. And just a few years later, we were up to our necks in Vietnam.
You know, I doubt very much if people actually seek a mentor. It's something that occurs gradually, and I'm thinking today of young people starting out in a business, coming out of journalism school or whatever. Would you advise them to kind of be on the lookout for somebody who can influence your career?
Oh, absolutely. I think watching someone or shadowing someone or working with someone who has been in the business and someone who is good at what he or she does is an excellent way for young people to learn the business and to become better at what they are doing and to get into the career if they are interested in journalism or any field for that matter. Mentors are very important. We were fortunate enough to have a young woman who worked with us about 3 weeks during the Christmas holidays, and she was a delightful young woman, but she has so much to learn, and I feel sure that she will find other mentors to work with her, and I feel sure that at some point she will come back to this area or go to a larger area and become a good journalist if that is the field she wishes to continue.
Bobbie, I want to move into a question that is appropriate, I think, but has not necessarily a positive effect. But I know you've reported on many tragic events. And one in particular I can think of is an automobile accident in Cadiz, where several young men were killed just before Christmas and several years ago. How do you prepare yourself mentally when you know that the event you're driving to, or you know what that scene is going to look like?
Well, you simply take a deep breath, and I'm a person of faith, and I always whisper to myself, Lord, help me. Mm-hmm. And I somehow am able to summon the courage to do what I have to do, what I need to do. That particular accident killed 7 young teenage men, high school students, and the next day I was in the Paducah Sun office at the time the news of the accident came over the scanner, and I stopped for a few minutes. There was another reporter coming on duty and I was going off duty. The other reporter took the job of going out to that accident site, but the next morning I was sent to continue the follow-up. We did what we call team coverage on those major stories at that time, and I walked into a news conference put on by the high school students, some of the seniors, and the superintendent's son said he had walked into the gym that morning, and when he walked into the gym, the only thing he could hear were tears hitting the floor. And that's difficult. Those things are difficult to cover, but you keep your eyes and your ears focused on what you have to do, and then maybe you have to go home and cry.
Well, you know, on the other hand, you've reported on thousands of very cheerful events, and you have, somehow or another, you have a knack for transferring that feeling to your readers. How do you accomplish this? Is this just a subconscious act, or do you think about it?
I think it probably is subconscious. It comes from the heart, and yes, I have covered many heartwarming stories. I remember one incident in the early 1980s. I was editor at the Tribune-Courier at the time, and an older gentleman, he was in his 70s at the time, his name was Ben Walters, lived in Cypress, California. He was a native of Marshall County, but he had lived in California for many years after being discharged from the military service. And he came in the office and he said, I'm looking for my pieces. And he sat down and told me the most heartrending story. And he told me of his family having been separated when he was a teenager. There were several members of the family, and his youngest brother was still being breastfed by their mother. Their mother was mentally ill, and the powers that be in Marshall County at that time determined that she had to be put away. And so one day her family was brought into Benton, and on the court square his father, Mr. Walters, had fought the edict that the children be taken away and be adopted by others, and that his wife be put away in an insane asylum. And he was jailed there in the courthouse because the powers that be said that she must be put away. And the baby was nursing at the time, and he was literally wrenched from his mother's breast on the courthouse square. Mr. Walters was telling me all this. And one gentleman was heard to say, "Well, the baby's still on the teat." And Mr. Walters had been looking for all these years. These children had been taken to Louisville and adopted out by other families. He had found all his brothers and sisters except that baby. And I wrote a story about it, and from time to time Mr. Walters would come back to Benton. Now, these were in subsequent years. And it's sad to even think about it, even this far down the road. But the last time I saw Mr. Walters, he came into the office with a younger man, and it was his baby brother. He had found him living in Texas, and this younger brother had not believed the story. He knew he was adopted, but he did not believe the story he was being told of his family being separated by the authorities. But his wife said to him, "Look in the mirror." And they looked very much alike. Mr. Walters and his younger brother looked very much alike. And I found that to be a very gratifying story that I had followed for in the neighborhood of 3 to 4 years.
Well, Bobbie, that is a very heartwarming story, and I want to close with one final question. 40 years of reporting in Western Kentucky. You're among the few people that are probably familiar with a lot of events and things, not only here in Lyon County, but all throughout Western Kentucky over the last 40 or 50 years. Any chance for a book somewhere down the road?
Well, I've always said I'd like to do that, and I have started making a list of events that I have covered that I think might be of interest to the public. And I've said in past years that I may not have the personal discipline to just sit down and write a book, but I'm thinking about it more and more, and maybe one of these days I'll do it.
Well, I know that someday down the road you may retire, but Bobbie, I don't think you'll ever stop writing.
I don't expect to.
Bobbie, thank you very much for this interview, and we've enjoyed it, and we look forward to working with you and reading in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. It's been a pleasure.
This news segment is brought to you by the Herald Ledger, the voice of Lyon County since 1901. Pick up a copy today, join us online for our e-edition, or catch us on Facebook.